The photograph arrived at the Smithsonian Institution on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987. It came wrapped in brown paper, postmarked from a small town in rural Pennsylvania called Hemlock Hollow. There was no return address, no letter of explanation. Only the image itself, a sepia-toned family portrait, dated 1901, showing 7 members of what appeared to be a prosperous farming family standing before a white clapboard house. The archivist who opened the package was a woman named Dr. Eleanor Vance. She had spent 23 years cataloging American folk history, and in that time, she had seen thousands of similar photographs. Families frozen in time, faces long turned to dust, eyes staring across the century with expressions that seemed to ask, "Will anyone remember us?" But this photograph was different. Dr. Vance noticed it almost immediately, a detail so subtle that most observers would dismiss it as a trick of light or a flaw in the developing process. In the back row, standing between his mother and father, was a boy of perhaps 12 years old. He wore a dark wool suit, too formal for the summer heat suggested by the wilting flowers in the garden behind him. His hair was parted severely to the left. His hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as though he had been told to remain perfectly still and had obeyed with unusual discipline. But it was his face that made Dr. Vance set down her coffee cup and reached for her magnifying glass. The boy's eyes were open, yet they possessed a quality that the archivist had never encountered in her decades of study. They were not merely vacant or unfocused, as sometimes happened when subjects blinked during the long exposure times required by 19th century cameras. No, these eyes seemed to look through the lens, through time itself, with an awareness that felt almost accusatory. And there was something else. Something in the geometry of his features that seemed wrong, though Dr. Vance could not immediately articulate what it was. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line. "The Whitmore family, Hemlock Hollow, Pennsylvania. July 14th, 1901. God forgive us. God forgive us." Dr. Vance had seen many inscriptions on the backs of old photographs. Names and dates were common. Occasionally there were brief messages, "With love from Mother," or "Our first home." But never a plea for forgiveness, never words that suggested guilt or horror or a secret too heavy to carry into the grave. She spent the remainder of that morning examining the image under various magnifications. The photograph appeared authentic. The paper stock was consistent with materials used at the turn of the century. The clothing, the architectural details of the house, the style of the garden fence, everything aligned with the stated date and location. There was no evidence of manipulation, no signs that the image had been altered or composited from multiple sources. And yet, the boy in the back row continued to disturb her. His proportions seemed slightly incorrect, though she could not determine in what way. His skin appeared smoother than that of his siblings, almost luminous against the muted tones of the surrounding faces. And his shadow. Dr. Vance spent nearly an hour studying the shadows in the photograph, the way the afternoon sun fell across the porch and the bodies of the family members. Every shadow aligned perfectly, cast at the proper angle, fading at the appropriate distance. Every shadow except his. The boy cast no shadow at all. Dr. Vance told herself it was a developing error, a chemical anomaly in the photographic process. Perhaps the boy had moved slightly during the exposure, blurring his shadow beyond recognition. These things happened. They were documented. There was nothing unusual about it. But that night, alone in her apartment on Connecticut Avenue, she found herself unable to sleep. She kept seeing the boy's face in her mind, those eyes that seemed to follow her, that expression of patient knowing. And she kept hearing the words written on the back of the photograph as though they were being whispered directly into her ear by a voice that had waited 86 years to speak. God forgive us. The next morning, Dr. Vance began her research into the Whitmore family of Hemlock Hollow, Pennsylvania. She expected to find the usual records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, perhaps a mention in a local newspaper or church registry. What she found instead was a silence so complete, so deliberate, that it could only mean one thing. Someone had erased the Whitmores from history, and they had done it for a reason. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you appreciate stories that history tried to bury, stories that reveal the hidden darkness beneath America's forgotten past, then join us. Subscribe now, because what you are about to hear will change the way you look at old photographs forever. Hemlock Hollow no longer exists on any modern map of Pennsylvania. The town, such as it was, occupied a narrow valley between two ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through dense forests of pine and hemlock. At its peak in 1895, the community numbered approximately 300 souls. Farmers mostly, along with a handful of merchants, a blacksmith, a doctor, and a minister who presided over the small Presbyterian church that stood at the center of town. The valley had been settled in 1847 by a group of families from eastern Pennsylvania who sought isolation from the rapid industrialization transforming the rest of the state. They were not religious separatists in the traditional sense, but they shared a common belief that modern society had lost something essential, a connection to the land, to community, to values that could not be measured in dollars or factory output. They named their settlement after the trees that covered the surrounding hillsides. Trees whose dark branches blocked the sun and gave the valley a perpetual twilight even at midday. For nearly 50 years, Hemlock Hollow prospered in its quiet way. The soil was rich, fed by streams that descended from the mountains. The winters were harsh but manageable. The families intermarried, shared labor during harvest seasons, and raised their children according to principles that had governed rural life for generations. They had little contact with the outside world, and they preferred it that way. The Whitmore family was among the original settlers. Josiah Whitmore, the patriarch who led his wife and 3 young children into the valley in the autumn of 1847, had been a successful merchant in Philadelphia before abandoning his business and his comfortable brick townhouse for reasons he never fully explained. His descendants would later claim that Josiah had experienced a vision, a dream in which he saw the cities of America consumed by fire while a green valley remained untouched, its people surviving whatever catastrophe awaited. But these were stories told by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, embellished with each retelling. The truth, as always, was more complicated. By 1901, the Whitmore family had become the most prominent household in Hemlock Hollow. The current patriarch, Ezra Whitmore, owned nearly 400 acres of prime farmland. His wife, Martha, was known throughout the valley for her herbal remedies and her skill as a midwife. She had delivered more than half the children born in Hemlock Hollow over the previous 2 decades. Together they had 5 children, 3 daughters named Faith, Hope, and Charity, and 2 sons named Abel and Samuel. But the photograph that arrived at the Smithsonian showed 7 family members, not 6. The boy standing between Ezra and Martha, the boy with the strange eyes and the missing shadow, was not listed in any record that Dr. Eleanor Vance could find. He appeared in no census data, no church registry, no school enrollment. He had no birth certificate, no baptismal record, no mention in the family Bible that had been donated to a historical society in Harrisburg after the last Whitmore descendant died in 1952. According to every official document, this boy did not exist. Dr. Vance might have dismissed the anomaly as a simple case of incomplete records. Rural communities in 19th century America often failed to document every birth, particularly those that ended in early death. Infant mortality was high. Children died of fevers, accidents, diseases that modern medicine would easily cure. Perhaps this boy had lived only a few years, his brief existence deemed too painful to remember, too insignificant to record. But then Dr. Vance found the letter. It was buried in an archive at the Pennsylvania State Library, misfiled among correspondence related to a boundary dispute between 2 neighboring counties. The letter was dated September 3, 1901, less than 2 months after the photograph was taken, and it was addressed to the governor of Pennsylvania from a man named Dr. Harrison Cole, who identified himself as the county medical examiner for the region that included Hemlock Hollow. The letter was 3 pages long, written in a cramped, agitated hand that suggested the author was composing in great haste or under great distress. Dr. Vance read it twice, then a 3rd time, her hands trembling slightly as the implications of the words became clear. Dr. Cole wrote that he had been summoned to Hemlock Hollow on the morning of August 29, 1901, following reports of what the local constable described as an incident of an unprecedented and disturbing nature. Upon arriving in the valley, Dr. Cole found the entire community in a state of shock. The Presbyterian church had been locked, its windows covered with black cloth. The general store was closed. The streets, such as they were, stood empty, with not even a dog visible among the silent houses. The constable led Dr. Cole to the Whitmore farm, where a crowd of perhaps 50 people had gathered outside the main house. They parted silently as the medical examiner approached, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the ground. Several women were weeping. One man, later identified as the town blacksmith, was reciting the Lord's Prayer in a continuous, desperate whisper. Inside the house, Dr. Cole found the bodies. There were 6 of them, arranged in the parlor with a care that suggested ritual rather than violence. Ezra and Martha Whitmore lay side by side on the floor, their hands clasped together, their eyes closed. Their 3 daughters, Faith, Hope, and Charity, were positioned nearby, each dressed in white, each holding a single hemlock branch. The eldest son, Abel, sat in a wooden chair facing the window, his head bowed as though in prayer. All 6 had died from the same cause: ingestion of a lethal dose of hemlock extract, prepared, it would later be determined, by Martha Whitmore herself, using knowledge she had accumulated during her years as the valley's herbalist and healer. The Whitmore family had committed suicide, all of them, together, on the same night, in the same room, using poison that the mother had brewed with her own hands. But there was one family member missing. Samuel Whitmore, the younger son, was not among the dead. His body was not in the house, not in the barn, not anywhere on the 400 acres of Whitmore land. A search of the surrounding forest found no trace of him. It was as though the boy had simply vanished, walked out of the valley and disappeared into the mountains, leaving behind only a single piece of evidence that he had ever existed at all: the photograph. It was found on the mantelpiece in the parlor, positioned carefully between 2 candles that had burned down to their bases. The image showed the entire family, all 7 of them, standing before the house in what must have been happier times. And on the back, in Martha Whitmore's handwriting, were the words that would haunt Dr. Eleanor Vance for the rest of her life: God forgive us. The investigation into the Whitmore deaths was brief and deliberately inconclusive. Dr. Harrison Cole submitted his report to the county authorities, who forwarded it to the state capitol, where it was reviewed by officials who seemed far more interested in suppressing the story than in understanding it. Within 2 weeks, the case was officially closed. The cause of death was listed as self-inflicted poisoning during a period of collective mental disturbance. No further inquiry was deemed necessary. But Dr. Cole could not let the matter rest. In the weeks following his initial visit to Hemlock Hollow, he returned to the valley 3 more times, each visit yielding fragments of information that only deepened the mystery. The residents were reluctant to speak with him. They answered his questions in monosyllables, their eyes constantly darting toward the tree line as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Several families had already begun packing their belongings, preparing to abandon homes their ancestors had built half a century earlier. It was on his 3rd visit in late September 1901 that Dr. Cole finally found someone willing to talk. Her name was Agnes Pruitt, and she was 87 years old, the oldest resident of Hemlock Hollow by nearly 2 decades. She had known Josiah Whitmore, the original patriarch, and she had watched his descendants grow and multiply over 5 generations. She was too old to flee, she told Dr. Cole, and too close to death to fear whatever punishment might await those who broke the valley's silence. Agnes received the medical examiner in her small cabin at the edge of town, offering him tea brewed from herbs she could no longer identify by name. Her hands shook as she poured, but her voice remained steady as she began to tell the story that the people of Hemlock Hollow had kept hidden for nearly 12 years. It began, Agnes said, in the winter of 1889. That year, the winter came early and stayed late. Snow fell in October and did not fully melt until May. The temperature dropped to levels that the oldest residents could not remember experiencing, cold so intense that it killed livestock in their barns and froze the streams solid to their beds. Food grew scarce. Firewood ran low. By February, the people of Hemlock Hollow were beginning to starve. The Whitmore family suffered along with everyone else, but their suffering carried an additional weight. Martha Whitmore was pregnant with her 6th child, a pregnancy that had come late, unexpectedly, when she was already 43 years old and had believed her childbearing years behind her. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Martha experienced constant nausea, debilitating fatigue, and pains in her abdomen that no herbal remedy could soothe. Dr. Cole's predecessor, an elderly physician named Dr. Warren, visited the Whitmore farm several times during that winter, each time leaving with a more worried expression than before. The child was born on the coldest night of the year, February 17, 1889. The temperature had fallen to 32 degrees below zero. The wind howled through the valley like a living thing, tearing shingles from roofs and piling snow against doors until they could not be opened. No one could travel that night, not even to summon help. Martha Whitmore labored alone with her husband, delivering the child in the same bedroom where she had delivered all her previous children. But this birth was different. Agnes paused here, her aged eyes growing distant as though she were seeing something far away, something she had spent years trying to forget. Dr. Cole waited, his pen poised over his notebook, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air of the cabin. "The child," Agnes finally said, "was born dead." Or at least, that was what everyone believed. The infant emerged from the womb silent and still, its skin a grayish blue, its tiny chest unmoving. Martha screamed, a sound that several neighbors later reported hearing despite the howling wind, while Ezra stood frozen at her bedside, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. For several minutes, they simply stared at the motionless body, their grief too enormous for tears. Then, according to Agnes, something happened that no one in Hemlock Hollow could explain. The child opened its eyes. Not gradually, not with the slow awakening of a newborn rousing from sleep, but suddenly, instantly, as though a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside its tiny body. The eyes that stared up at Ezra and Martha Whitmore were not the unfocused eyes of an infant. They were clear, aware, almost ancient in their depth. And they were watching. The child did not cry. It did not move or make any sound. It simply lay there, its blue-gray skin slowly flushing with color, its chest beginning to rise and fall in a rhythm that seemed too slow, too deliberate, to be natural. Martha later told Agnes that holding the child felt like holding something that had been borrowed, something that did not fully belong to the world of the living. They named him Samuel, after Ezra's father. They baptized him in the Presbyterian church 3 weeks later, when the weather had finally warmed enough to allow travel. The minister, a young man named Reverend Hollis, who had arrived in Hemlock Hollow only 2 years earlier, performed the ceremony with visible reluctance, his hands trembling as he poured water over the child's forehead. Afterward, he confided to his wife that the infant had watched him throughout the entire baptism, with an expression that made him feel as though he were the one being judged. Samuel Whitmore grew, but he did not grow normally. By the age of 3, he could read, not simple words, but entire books, volumes of theology and natural philosophy that his father kept in the study. By 5, he could recite passages from the Bible in the original Greek and Hebrew, languages that no one in Hemlock Hollow knew and that he could not possibly have learned from any available source. By 7, he had stopped attending the one-room schoolhouse because the teacher confessed she had nothing left to teach him. He knew more than she did about every subject, including subjects she had never studied. But it was not his intelligence that frightened the people of Hemlock Hollow. Intelligence could be explained even if it was unusual. Some children were simply gifted, blessed by God with minds that exceeded ordinary limitations. No. What frightened them was his presence. Samuel rarely spoke unless asked a direct question. He did not play with other children. He showed no interest in the games, the adventures, the small joys that filled the lives of his siblings and their friends. Instead, he spent his days walking through the valley, following paths that only he could see, stopping at seemingly random locations to stand motionless for hours at a time, his eyes fixed on something invisible to everyone else. And then there were the incidents. Agnes described them hesitantly, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, as though she feared that speaking the words aloud might summon something better left undisturbed. The first incident occurred when Samuel was 4 years old. A neighbor's dog, a large, aggressive animal known for attacking livestock, broke free from its chain and charged at Samuel while he was walking near the edge of town. Several witnesses saw what happened next, though none could agree on exactly what they saw. The dog stopped. It stopped running, stopped barking, stopped moving entirely. It stood frozen in mid-stride, its jaws open, its eyes wide with what one witness described as mortal terror. Then very slowly, it turned and walked away, its tail tucked between its legs, whimpering like a puppy. The dog never barked again. It died 3 months later, refusing to eat, staring constantly at the corner of its owner's barn as though waiting for something that never came. Comment now. Write in the comments. I've seen eyes like that in old photographs. If this story has already touched something inside you, if you feel the weight of what is being revealed, leave this message so I can know who is truly listening. The incidents multiplied as Samuel grew older. When he was 6, the valley experienced a drought, the worst in living memory. Crops withered. Wells ran dry. The people of Hemlock Hollow began to fear that they would face another season of starvation, another winter of watching their children grow thin and weak while the earth refused to yield its bounty. Prayers were offered, rituals were performed. Nothing seemed to help. Then Samuel spoke. He approached his father one morning in late July and said in his quiet, measured voice that the rain would come on the 3rd day of August. He said it with such certainty, such calm conviction, that Ezra found himself unable to dismiss it as a child's fantasy. He told no one else what Samuel had said. He did not want to raise false hopes, did not want to be mocked for believing the words of a strange child. On the 3rd day of August, the rain came. It fell for 3 days without stopping, filling the wells, reviving the crops, saving Hemlock Hollow from disaster. And when it was over, when the sun emerged and the farmers walked through their fields marveling at the impossible resurrection of their harvest, Ezra Whitmore looked at his youngest son with new eyes that held equal measures of wonder and fear. Samuel continued to make predictions. He told the blacksmith that his forge would catch fire on a Tuesday in September. It did. He warned a family that their eldest daughter would fall ill with scarlet fever during the first week of October. She did, but survived because they had prepared medicines in advance. He announced the exact date that winter would arrive, the precise depth of the first snowfall, the number of calves that would be born in the spring. He was never wrong. Word of Samuel's abilities spread beyond the valley, carried by travelers and merchants who passed through on their way to larger towns. Some dismissed the stories as rural superstition, the exaggerations of isolated people who had little education and too much time to spin tales. But others listened with interest. A professor from the University of Pennsylvania wrote a letter requesting permission to study the boy. A journalist from Philadelphia made the difficult journey to Hemlock Hollow, only to be turned away at the edge of town by men with rifles who informed him that strangers were not welcome. The people of Hemlock Hollow had decided to protect their secret. They had also decided to use it. By 1897, when Samuel was 8 years old, the community had developed an informal system for consulting him. Farmers would approach Ezra Whitmore with questions about planting times and weather patterns. Merchants sought advice about when to buy and sell. Young couples asked whether their marriages would be blessed with children. The answers always came through Ezra, who would pose the questions to Samuel and relay his responses. Samuel himself never seemed to mind this arrangement. He answered every question with the same detached precision, as though he were reading from a book that only he could see. But there were questions he refused to answer. He would not speak of death. When asked how long someone would live, or whether a sick person would recover, Samuel would simply close his eyes and shake his head, his face expressionless, his silence absolute. At first, the people of Hemlock Hollow respected this boundary. They assumed it was a kindness, that the boy did not want to burden them with knowledge they could not bear. Then came the incident with the Miller child. Thomas Miller was 7 years old, the only son of a farmer who lived at the northern edge of the valley. In the spring of 1898, Thomas developed a cough that would not go away. At first, his parents thought it was a simple cold, the kind that passed through the community every year. But the cough grew worse. Thomas began to lose weight. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his eyes sank deep into their sockets, giving him the appearance of a much older child carrying burdens far beyond his years. Martha Whitmore examined the boy and recognized the symptoms immediately: consumption, tuberculosis. In 1898, there was no cure. The disease was a death sentence, sometimes quick, sometimes slow, but always inevitable. Thomas's father, desperate to save his only child, went to the Whitmore farm and begged Ezra to ask Samuel whether the boy would live. Ezra refused at first, explaining that Samuel did not answer questions about death. But the father persisted, returning day after day, his pleas growing more desperate as Thomas grew weaker. Finally, Ezra relented. That evening, he brought his youngest son into the parlor and asked the question that had hung over the valley like a storm cloud for weeks. Would Thomas Miller survive his illness? Samuel was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than Ezra had ever heard it, softer, almost sad, as though the words themselves caused him pain. Thomas would not survive. He would die on the morning of June 14, 1898, at precisely 7:23 in the morning, while the sun was rising over the eastern ridge. His last words would be, "I see them coming," and then he would be gone. Ezra did not relay this information to Thomas's father. He told him only that Samuel could not see the outcome, that some things remained hidden even from his extraordinary perception. The father accepted this answer, though his eyes suggested he did not believe it. He returned home to spend what time remained with his son. Thomas Miller died on June 14, 1898, at 7:23 in the morning. His last words were, "I see them coming." After that, no one asked Samuel about death again. Agnes Pruitt paused in her narrative, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup, her eyes fixed on the small window that looked out over the valley she had called home for nearly 9 decades. Dr. Cole waited, his notebook filled with cramped handwriting, his medical training struggling to reconcile what he was hearing with everything he had been taught about the natural world. Finally, Agnes continued. By 1899, she said, the people of Hemlock Hollow had grown accustomed to Samuel's presence among them. They no longer flinched when they passed him on the road. They no longer whispered prayers under their breath when his strange, ancient eyes turned in their direction. They had learned to live with the miracle, or the curse, that had been placed in their midst. But Samuel was changing. As he approached his 10th birthday, his physical development seemed to slow while his mental faculties continued to expand at an alarming rate. He remained small for his age, his body frozen in a state of perpetual childhood, while his mind ventured into territories that no human being had ever explored. He began to speak less, retreating into silences that could last for days. When he did speak, his words often made no sense to those who heard them, references to events that had not yet occurred, people who had not yet been born, technologies that would not be invented for decades. And he began to remember things. Not memories of his own brief life, but memories that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. He would describe, in vivid detail, events that had occurred in the valley before he was born. The harsh winter of 1864, the flood of 1872, the fever that had claimed 11 lives in the autumn of 1881. He knew the names of people who had died before his parents were married. He could recite conversations that had taken place in rooms he had never entered, between people he had never met. It was Reverend Hollis who first voiced the suspicion that had been growing in the hearts of Hemlock Hollow's residents for years. The minister visited the Whitmore farm in the summer of 1899, ostensibly to discuss preparations for the annual harvest festival. But his true purpose was different. He wanted to speak with Samuel alone. The boy received him in the parlor, sitting in the same wooden chair where his brother Abel would later be found dead. Reverend Hollis sat across from him, his Bible clutched in his hands, his voice trembling as he asked the question that had haunted him since the day he poured baptismal water over that infant's head. "What are you?" Samuel smiled, the first smile anyone in Hemlock Hollow had ever seen on his face. It was not a warm smile, not the smile of a child amused by an adult's foolishness. It was the smile of someone who had waited a very long time for this moment, who had known it would come eventually, who had perhaps even orchestrated events to ensure that it would. The boy leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locking with the minister's, and he began to speak. He spoke for 3 hours without interruption. He told Reverend Hollis things about the valley, about its history, about its future, that no living person could possibly know. He described the founding families in detail so precise that it could only have come from first-hand observation. He revealed secrets, sins committed in darkness, crimes buried beneath the soil, betrayals that had shaped the community's development for generations. He knew everything. He had always known everything. And then he told Reverend Hollis the truth about himself. He was not, he explained, what the people of Hemlock Hollow believed him to be. He was not a miracle child blessed with divine gifts. He was not a prophet sent to guide the community through troubled times. He was something far older, far stranger, far more terrible than any of them had imagined. He was a memory. The valley itself, Samuel explained, had a consciousness, not in the way that humans understood consciousness, but a deeper, more ancient form of awareness that had developed over millennia. The mountains, the streams, the forests of hemlock that gave the town its name, they were not merely landscape. They were organs of a vast entity that experienced time differently than human beings, that measured its existence in geological epochs rather than human generations. And sometimes, when the conditions were right, this consciousness needed a voice. It needed a way to communicate with the small, brief creatures who lived within its boundaries. It needed a vessel. Samuel was that vessel. The child who had been born dead on that frozen February night in 1889 had not returned to life through any natural process. His body had been occupied, inhabited, filled with an awareness that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. The personality that walked among them, that spoke with them, that answered their questions about weather and harvests and the small concerns of mortal existence, that personality was not human. It was the valley itself, speaking through a borrowed mouth, seeing through borrowed eyes, experiencing human existence for the first time in thousands of years. Reverend Hollis fled the Whitmore farm that evening, his Bible forgotten on the parlor floor, his faith shattered beyond repair. He told no one what Samuel had revealed to him, not his wife, not his congregation, not even God in his nightly prayers, because he was no longer certain that God was listening. He continued to perform his duties as minister, to deliver sermons and conduct services and comfort the dying, but those who knew him well noticed that something essential had gone out of him. The light in his eyes had been extinguished. 3 months later, Reverend Hollis hanged himself in the church bell tower. He left no note. The truth spread slowly through Hemlock Hollow, passed in whispers between neighbors, discussed in hushed tones around kitchen tables after the children had been put to bed. No one wanted to believe what Reverend Hollis had learned in his final conversation with Samuel Whitmore. But no one could deny the evidence that had accumulated over the years, the predictions that always came true, the knowledge that should have been impossible, the presence that felt wrong in ways that language could not capture. By the spring of 1901, the community had reached a breaking point. The Whitmore family found themselves increasingly isolated. Neighbors who had once sought their advice now avoided them. Friends who had shared meals and celebrations for generations suddenly found reasons to decline invitations. Even the other children in the valley, who had never fully accepted Samuel as one of their own, now refused to come anywhere near the Whitmore farm. Martha Whitmore watched her family disintegrate with the helpless anguish of a mother who sees her children suffering and cannot protect them. She knew what Samuel was. She had known from the moment he opened his eyes on that frozen February night, had felt the wrongness of his presence even as she held him to her breast and pretended that everything was normal. She had spent 12 years trying to love him anyway, trying to see past the ancient thing that looked out through his eyes to find something human, something worthy of a mother's affection. She had failed. In June of 1901, Martha made a decision. She did not consult her husband. She did not pray for guidance. She simply walked into the forest one morning and began gathering the plants she would need. Hemlock, primarily, but also other herbs that would ease the passage, that would make the ending peaceful rather than painful. She had delivered hundreds of children into the world during her years as a midwife. Now she would deliver her family out of it. She told Ezra her plan on the evening of July 13, 1901, after the children had gone to bed. She expected him to resist, to argue, to remind her of their vows and their faith and the sacred obligation of parents to protect their children. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes wet with tears, his voice steady as he spoke the words that Martha had been waiting to hear. He agreed. They would do it together, as a family. They would end it on their own terms, before the valley could claim them in its own way, before Samuel's presence could spread whatever darkness he carried to the wider world. They would protect their community one final time, even if no one would ever know the sacrifice they had made. The next morning, July 14, 1901, the family posed for the photograph that would eventually find its way to the Smithsonian Institution. A traveling photographer had come to the valley earlier that summer, offering portraits at prices that even modest farming families could afford. Martha had arranged the session weeks earlier, before she had made her final decision, and she saw no reason to cancel it now. She wanted something to remain, evidence that her family had existed, had loved each other, had faced an impossible situation with courage and grace. They dressed in their finest clothes. They arranged themselves before the house where generations of Whitmores had lived and died. They held still for the long exposure, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on the camera lens with expressions that would puzzle historians for decades. And Samuel stood among them, knowing everything that would happen that night, choosing not to prevent it. Why? This was the question that Dr. Harrison Cole could not answer, the question that Dr. Eleanor Vance would spend the rest of her career trying to understand. If Samuel truly possessed the knowledge that the people of Hemlock Hollow attributed to him, why did he allow his family to kill themselves? Why did he participate in the photograph, stand beside the people who were planning to take their own lives, and do nothing to stop them? Agnes Pruitt offered one possible explanation in her final conversation with Dr. Cole. Perhaps, she said, Samuel wanted to be free. Perhaps the consciousness that inhabited his body had grown tired of its borrowed existence, tired of experiencing the world through human senses, tired of the limitations imposed by flesh and blood and bone. Perhaps it had allowed the Whitmore family to reach their terrible decision because it saw their plan as an escape, a way to return to the vast, slow awareness from which it had come, to rejoin the mountains and the streams and the ancient forests that had been its home for millennia before human beings ever set foot in the valley. Or perhaps, Agnes suggested, the entity simply did not care. Perhaps human lives meant nothing to something that measured time and epochs, that had watched countless generations rise and fall without feeling anything that a human being would recognize as emotion. Perhaps the Whitmore family was nothing more than an experiment that had run its course, a vessel that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. Dr. Cole never learned what happened to Samuel after the rest of his family died. The boy's body was never found. No trace of him appeared in any record from any subsequent period, no death certificate, no asylum admission, no sighting by travelers or residents of neighboring communities. He had simply vanished, as though he had never existed at all. Or perhaps he had returned to the valley that had created him. Hemlock Hollow was abandoned within 2 years of the Whitmore deaths. The remaining families scattered to cities and towns across Pennsylvania, carrying with them memories they would never share and secrets they would take to their graves. The buildings fell into ruin. The forest reclaimed the fields. The road that had once connected the valley to the outside world became impassable, choked with fallen trees and washed out by floods that came with increasing frequency. Today, the valley is accessible only on foot, through miles of dense forest that few hikers dare to penetrate. Those who have made the journey report finding nothing but foundations overgrown with moss, collapsed chimneys rising from the underbrush like ancient monuments, and the persistent feeling of being watched by something they cannot see. The photograph that arrived at the Smithsonian remains in the institution's archives, cataloged but rarely displayed. Dr. Eleanor Vance retired in 1995, her research into the Whitmore family incomplete, her questions unanswered. She died in 2003, leaving behind boxes of notes that her executors donated to a historical society in Harrisburg, the same society that holds the Whitmore family Bible, still bearing no mention of a son named Samuel. But the photograph endures. And if you look closely, very closely, at the boy standing in the back row, you might notice something that Dr. Vance noticed on that March morning in 1987, something that countless viewers have noticed in the decades since, without being able to articulate what it is. The boy is looking at you, not at the camera, not at the photographer who stood behind it, not at the lens that captured light and shadow and preserved them for generations to come. He is looking at you, specifically, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you happen to view the image. He has been waiting for you, and now that you have seen him, you will never be able to forget those eyes, ancient, knowing, patient beyond all human understanding. Eyes that have watched the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars, the slow turning of the earth through eons of time. Eyes that will continue watching long after you and everyone you know has returned to the dust from which you came. The valley remembers. The valley always remembers. Dr. Eleanor Vance believed her investigation into the Whitmore family had reached its conclusion when she retired from the Smithsonian in 1995. She had spent 8 years gathering documents, interviewing descendants of Hemlock Hollow's scattered residents, and attempting to construct a coherent narrative from fragments of testimony that often contradicted each other. She had filled 14 notebooks with her findings, organized thousands of pages of correspondence, and written a draft manuscript that no publisher would accept because no editor believed the story could possibly be true. But the story was not finished with her. In the autumn of 2001, exactly 100 years after the Whitmore family's deaths, Dr. Vance received a package at her home in suburban Maryland. Like the photograph that had started her investigation decades earlier, this package bore no return address. The postmark was smudged beyond legibility. The paper was brown and ordinary, the kind that could be purchased at any office supply store in America. Inside was a journal. The leather cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age, the binding barely holding together after a century of existence. The first page bore an inscription in handwriting that Dr. Vance recognized immediately. It was identical to the handwriting on the back of the photograph, the same careful script that had written the words, "God forgive us." This was Martha Whitmore's journal. It covered the final year of her life, from July 1900 to July 1901. It documented everything. Her growing horror at Samuel's true nature, her desperate attempts to find another solution, her ultimate acceptance that there was only one way to protect her family and her community from the thing that had taken up residence in her youngest son's body. But the journal contained something else, something that Dr. Vance had never expected to find. It contained Martha's account of a conversation she had with Samuel on the night before the photograph was taken, a conversation in which the boy, or the entity speaking through the boy, had revealed things about the future that Martha could not possibly have understood, predictions about events that would not occur for decades, warnings about catastrophes that would reshape the world. Samuel had spoken of great wars that would kill millions. He had described machines that would fly through the air and weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single instant. He had mentioned something called a network that would connect all human beings in ways that would have seemed like magic to a 19th century farm woman. And he had spoken of a photograph. This photograph, the one that would be taken the following morning, and how it would eventually find its way to a place of knowledge where a woman would discover it and begin asking questions that were never meant to be asked. Martha had not understood most of what Samuel told her, but she had understood enough to know that the photograph was important, that it was part of a plan far larger than anything she could comprehend, that by posing for it, she was participating in something that would extend far beyond her own brief existence. She had asked Samuel why. Why the photograph? Why preserve any evidence at all of a family that had chosen to erase itself from history? His answer, recorded in Martha's shaky handwriting on the final page of the journal, was simple: because someone needs to remember. Because the valley cannot speak for itself, not anymore, not since the people who lived within its boundaries stopped listening to its voice. Because human beings have grown deaf to the whispers of the land, blind to the patterns that connect all living things, ignorant of the ancient consciousness that flows through mountains and rivers and forests like blood through veins. The photograph was a message. It was a reminder that there are forces in this world that exist beyond human understanding, beyond human control, beyond the comfortable certainties of science and religion and everyday experience. It was evidence that the boundary between the natural and the impossible is thinner than anyone wants to believe, that sometimes the impossible breaks through, that sometimes the land itself reaches out and touches human lives in ways that can never be explained. Samuel had known that the photograph would survive. He had known that it would travel through decades, passing from hand to hand, until it reached someone capable of hearing what it had to say. He had known about Dr. Vance before she was born, had seen her life unfolding across the years, had watched from his timeless vantage point as she grew from a child fascinated by old photographs into a woman who would dedicate her career to preserving the forgotten stories of American history. She had been chosen. Not by fate, not by God, not by any power that fit neatly into human categories of belief. She had been chosen by the valley itself, by the ancient awareness that had once spoken through a boy named Samuel Whitmore, by the memory of a place that refused to be forgotten no matter how thoroughly human beings tried to erase it from the record. Dr. Eleanor Vance died on March 17, 2003, exactly 16 years after the photograph first arrived at the Smithsonian. Her death was attributed to heart failure, the natural end of a life that had stretched past 80 years. But those who visited her in her final days reported that she seemed distracted, her attention constantly wandering toward the window of her hospital room, her eyes focused on something they could not see. She was cremated according to her wishes. Her ashes were scattered in the Appalachian Mountains, in a valley whose name appears on no modern map, in a place where hemlock trees still grow in the shadows between ancient ridges. Some who knew her believed that this was a coincidence, that she had simply chosen a beautiful location for her final rest, that her decision had nothing to do with the investigation that had consumed the final decades of her life. Others are not so sure. The photograph remains in the Smithsonian's archives, available to researchers who know where to look and what questions to ask. The journal that arrived at Dr. Vance's home in 2001 has never been found. It was not among her possessions when her estate was settled, and no one knows what became of it. But the story persists. It passes from person to person, changed slightly with each retelling, growing and evolving like a living thing. Some versions emphasize the horror of Samuel's existence, the terror of a family confronting something beyond their comprehension. Others focus on the tragedy, on Martha's desperate love for a child she knew was not fully human, on Ezra's courage in facing an impossible choice. And some versions whisper of something else entirely. They speak of travelers who have ventured into the ruins of Hemlock Hollow and returned with stories of strange lights moving through the forest at night. They tell of voices heard in the wind, speaking words in a language that no human being has ever learned. They describe the feeling of being watched by something vast and patient, something that has been waiting for a very long time for human beings to remember what they have forgotten. The valley is still there. The valley is still watching. And somewhere, in a photograph taken on a summer morning over a century ago, a boy who should not be alive continues to stare through the lens of history, his eyes meeting yours across the gulf of years, his expression unchanged, his message undelivered. Until now. The Whitmore story did not end with Dr. Vance's death. In the years that followed, a small community of researchers, historians, and curiosity seekers began to gather around the mystery she had left behind. They communicated through letters at first, then through electronic messages as technology evolved, sharing fragments of information they had discovered in archives, libraries, and family collections scattered across the eastern United States. They called themselves the Hollow Watchers. The name was not meant to be dramatic. It was simply a description of what they did. They watched, they waited, and they listened for any sign that the story of Hemlock Hollow was not yet complete. Most of them were amateur historians, people who had stumbled across a reference to the Whitmore family in some obscure text and found themselves unable to let go of the questions it raised. A few were academics, scholars who risked their professional reputations by pursuing research that their colleagues dismissed as folklore at best, delusion at worst. One of these scholars was a young anthropologist named Dr. Marcus Webb, who discovered Dr. Vance's notebooks in the Harrisburg Historical Society in 2015. Marcus had been researching 19th century folk beliefs in Appalachian communities when he came across a reference to Hemlock Hollow in a footnote of a doctoral dissertation from 1978. The footnote mentioned a mass suicide of unclear origin and cited a letter from Dr. Harrison Cole that Marcus could not locate in any archive. The search for that letter led him to Dr. Vance's notebooks. Marcus spent 3 months reading through her research, following the threads she had woven, retracing the steps of an investigation that had consumed the final years of her life. By the time he finished, he understood why she had never published her findings, why no academic journal would have accepted her conclusions, why the story of the Whitmore family had remained buried for more than a century. It was not that the story was unbelievable. It was that believing it required accepting possibilities that the modern world had spent centuries trying to deny. Marcus did not consider himself a superstitious person. He had been trained in the scientific method, taught to evaluate evidence objectively, conditioned to reject explanations that could not be tested and verified through empirical observation. But Dr. Vance's notebooks contained something that he could not dismiss: a pattern. The Whitmore family was not unique. Scattered throughout Dr. Vance's research were references to similar cases: children born under unusual circumstances who exhibited knowledge they could not possibly possess, communities that turned against families harboring these strange children, collective acts of violence or self-destruction that followed the same terrible arc as the events in Hemlock Hollow. The details varied, but the structure remained constant: a birth, an awakening, a period of wonder followed by a period of fear, and finally a reckoning that left nothing behind but questions and silence. Dr. Vance had identified 17 such cases spanning 3 centuries of American history. She had found evidence of similar patterns in European archives, in Asian folklore, in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples from every inhabited continent. She had begun to develop a theory, incomplete, speculative, perhaps impossible to prove, that these events were not random occurrences, but expressions of something fundamental to the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. Marcus Webb continued her work. He spent 5 years gathering additional evidence, traveling to remote communities, interviewing elderly residents who remembered stories their grandparents had told them about children who knew too much and families that disappeared without explanation. He found court records, church documents, personal letters and diaries that supported Dr. Vance's theory while raising new questions she had never considered. And in the autumn of 2020, he found something that changed everything. It was a photograph discovered in the estate of a collector who had died without heirs. The collector had spent his life acquiring images of what he called anomalous Americana, photographs that depicted scenes or subjects that defied easy explanation. Most of his collection was obvious fraud, manipulated images created to satisfy the Victorian appetite for spirit photography and supernatural spectacle. But this photograph was different. It showed a family of 7 standing before a white clapboard house. The date written on the back was July 14, 1901. The location was Hemlock Hollow, Pennsylvania. It was not the same photograph that had arrived at the Smithsonian in 1987. The composition was almost identical, the same arrangement of figures, the same pose, the same expressions. But the angle was slightly different, taken from a few feet to the left of the original image. And in this photograph, there was something visible that the original had not shown. Behind the family, barely visible through the parlor window of the house, was a 7th figure. Not Samuel, who stood in his usual place between his parents. Another figure, taller, thinner, its outline blurred but unmistakably present. A shape that should not have been there, that appeared in no other photograph from that day, that had somehow escaped notice for more than a century. Marcus Webb studied the image for weeks, using every technique available to modern photographic analysis. He could not determine what the figure was, could not explain how it had appeared in one photograph but not the other, could not reconcile its presence with any natural phenomenon he understood. But he knew what it meant. The valley had not been speaking through Samuel alone. In the summer of 2022, Marcus Webb organized an expedition to Hemlock Hollow. The valley had not been visited by researchers in decades. The last documented entry was in 1987, when a team of geologists surveying the region had noted the presence of ruins consistent with a 19th century settlement but had not investigated further. Since then, the forest had continued its slow reclamation, swallowing what remained of the town beneath layers of vegetation and debris. Marcus assembled a team of 5. Himself, a photographer named Sarah Chen, a geologist named David Okafor, a folklorist named Maria Santos, and a sound engineer named James Whitfield, whose equipment could detect acoustic anomalies beyond the range of human hearing. They entered the valley on July 14th, exactly 121 years after the Whitmore family photograph was taken. What they found exceeded anything Marcus had imagined. The ruins were still there, barely visible beneath the undergrowth. Stone foundations, collapsed chimneys, the remnants of a church whose steeple had fallen decades ago and now lay rotting among the ferns. But it was not the ruins that captured the team's attention. It was the silence. Hemlock Hollow was utterly, completely, impossibly silent. There were no birds singing in the trees, no insects buzzing among the wildflowers that grew in the clearings. No wind rustling through the leaves, no water flowing through the streams that should have been running with summer snowmelt from the ridges above. The forest was alive. The trees were healthy, the undergrowth was thick. Everything suggested a thriving ecosystem, but it produced no sound whatsoever. James Whitfield's equipment confirmed what their ears were telling them. There was no acoustic activity in the valley. None. The ambient noise level was lower than anything he had ever recorded, lower than the quietest soundproofed studio, lower than seemed physically possible in a natural environment. The team spent 3 days in Hemlock Hollow, documenting everything they could find. Sarah Chen photographed the ruins from every angle, creating a comprehensive record of what remained. David Okafor took soil samples and geological measurements that would later reveal no unusual mineral content or electromagnetic activity. Maria Santos recorded her observations and impressions, noting the strange quality of the silence and the persistent feeling of being watched that all 5 team members experienced. And Marcus Webb found the Whitmore farmhouse, or what was left of it. The house had collapsed decades ago, its timbers rotted, its walls fallen inward, its roof open to the sky. But the foundation remained intact, and the stone cellar beneath it was still accessible through a gap in the rubble that looked almost deliberately preserved, as though someone, or something, wanted it to be found. Marcus descended into the cellar alone. The space below was small, perhaps 20 feet square, with walls of mortared stone and a dirt floor that had remained dry despite the decades of exposure. In the center of the floor, arranged in a careful circle, were 7 objects that Marcus recognized immediately from Dr. Vance's notebooks. The objects were stones, smooth, oval, roughly the size of a human palm. Each was inscribed with a symbol that Dr. Vance had found repeated in documents from similar cases across the country. A vertical line intersected by 3 horizontal lines of decreasing length, forming a shape that some researchers had interpreted as a tree, others as a human figure with outstretched arms, and still others as something that had no parallel in any known symbolic system. The stones were arranged in order of size, from smallest to largest, forming a sequence that seemed to lead toward the eastern wall of the cellar. Marcus followed the sequence with his flashlight, moving from stone to stone until he reached the wall itself. There, carved into the foundation with a precision that seemed impossible for 19th century tools, was a single word: remember. Marcus Webb emerged from the cellar as the sun was setting behind the western ridge. He did not tell his team what he had found. He did not photograph the stones or the inscription. He simply stood at the edge of the ruins, looking out over the silent valley, feeling the weight of a century pressing down on him like a physical force. He understood now. The story of the Whitmore family was not a mystery to be solved. It was not a case to be closed, a question to be answered, a puzzle to be assembled from scattered pieces of evidence. It was a message, transmitted across time by means that human science could not explain, intended for anyone willing to listen. The valley wanted to be remembered, not as a location on a map, not as a footnote in a historical archive, not as a curiosity for researchers to debate in academic journals. It wanted to be remembered as what it truly was: a place where the boundary between human consciousness and something far older and far stranger had grown thin enough to permit communication. Samuel Whitmore had been that communication's first attempt. The photograph had been its continuation. And now, standing in the ruins of a town that had erased itself from history more than a century ago, Marcus Webb was its newest recipient. He did not know what he was supposed to do with the message he had received. He did not know whether he should publish his findings, share them with the small community of researchers who had been following the Whitmore story for years, or keep them to himself like so many others before him. He only knew that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of the world, that the comfortable certainties he had built his life upon had been swept away by something he could not name or categorize or explain. The team left Hemlock Hollow the following morning. They returned to their respective lives, their careers, their families and friends who would never believe what they had experienced. Some of them wrote about their findings in obscure journals that no one read. Others chose to remain silent, uncertain what purpose their testimony would serve. But all of them remembered. And sometimes late at night when sleep refused to come and the world outside their windows grew quiet enough to hear their own heartbeats, they found themselves thinking about a photograph taken on a summer morning in 1901. A photograph of a family that no longer exists, in a town that no longer appears on any map, containing a boy whose eyes seem to follow them across the years. They think about those eyes. They think about the silence. And they wonder whether someone, somewhere, is still watching. This story has come to you through channels that defy ordinary explanation. It has passed through the hands of archivists and historians, through the notebooks of researchers who dedicated their lives to understanding something that may never be fully understood. It has traveled across a century and a quarter, changing shape with each retelling, growing richer and stranger as new discoveries were made and new questions were raised. But the essential truth remains constant. In the summer of 1901, a family in rural Pennsylvania faced something that exceeded the boundaries of human comprehension. They made a choice, terrible, desperate, courageous in its own way, to protect their community from forces they could not control. And in making that choice, they left behind a single piece of evidence that their struggle had been real. A photograph of 7 people standing before a white house, one of whom should not have been alive. The boy in that photograph is still watching. Not as a ghost, not as a spirit, not as any of the supernatural entities that populate human folklore and imagination. He watches as an expression of something far older than ghosts, far stranger than spirits, far more patient than any human mind can conceive. He watches as the voice of a land that has been waiting for millennia to be heard. And now you have heard him. You have listened to the story that the valley wanted someone to tell. You have carried its memory into a world that has forgotten how to listen to the whispers of ancient places. You have become, in your own small way, part of the continuity that stretches from Martha Whitmore's journal to Dr. Vance's notebooks to the expedition that stood in silence among the ruins of Hemlock Hollow. What you do with this story is up to you. You can dismiss it as fiction, as folklore, as the kind of tale that people invent to make sense of tragedies they cannot explain. You can close this chapter and return to the comfortable certainties of everyday life, never thinking again about a boy named Samuel or a valley that swallowed a town and waited more than a century for someone to remember. Or you can look more closely at the old photographs in your family albums, at the faces staring out from sepia-toned images, at the eyes that seem to follow you when you turn your head. You can listen to the silence that falls sometimes in the small hours of the morning, when the world grows quiet enough to hear things that are normally drowned out by the noise of human existence. You can remember. The valley remembered for more than a century. It waded through 2 world wars, through the transformation of America from a rural nation to an urban one, through technological revolutions that would have seemed like miracles to the people of Hemlock Hollow. It waited for someone to find the photograph, to ask the right questions, to listen with ears that were open to impossible answers. It is still waiting. And now that you have heard its story, you carry part of that waiting with you. Perhaps you will never think about the Whitmore family again. Perhaps this story will fade from your memory like so many others, replaced by the endless demands of daily life and the constant flow of new information that characterizes our age. Perhaps you will dismiss everything you have heard as entertainment, as a well-crafted tale designed to pass the time and nothing more. But perhaps, someday, you will see a photograph that makes you pause, Perhaps you will notice something in the background. A shadow that falls wrong. A figure that seems out of place. Eyes that appear to look directly at you despite the century that separates you from the moment the image was captured. Perhaps you will feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature, a sensation of being observed by something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. And perhaps, in that moment, you will remember this story. You will remember the Whitmore family of Hemlock Hollow, Pennsylvania. You will remember Martha's journal and Dr. Vance's notebooks and the silent expedition that found 7 stones arranged in a cellar that had waited more than 100 years to be discovered. You will remember Samuel, the boy who was not a boy, the voice that was not a voice, the message that traveled across time to reach you in this moment. And you will understand that some stories are not meant to entertain. Some stories are meant to warn. Some stories are meant to remind us that the world is larger and stranger and more mysterious than we want to believe, that there are forces at work in the darkness beyond our perception, that the land beneath our feet has memories older than humanity itself. The Whitmore family understood this truth. They paid for that understanding with their lives. What price will you pay for remembering? Only time will tell. And the valley has nothing but time. If you have watched until the end, it means this story has touched something inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are and see who truly appreciates the stories shared on this channel. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it left you looking differently at the old photographs in your family's collection, then please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear what you have heard. And subscribe to this channel if you have not already. There are more stories waiting to be told, more secrets that history has tried to bury, more voices that have waited decades or centuries for someone to listen. Join us, and together we will remember what was never meant to be forgotten. The valley is watching. The valley is always watching, and now, so are you.